gave her the grant, and then I did the other grant for a year. That's kind of how that went. So our primary goal was to develop these support materials for the instructors. And so we collected video of every session of four sections. One of those remotely. We had like, what was that thing, technology called? Blackboard or something like that. Anyway, some sort of magic where we could see what he wrote on the board, and we had audio from the remote location. And then Joanna stayed around long enough in the fall to run the first two, and then Stray took over in the summer. And so why were we doing this? We had two goals. One was to do research on what this experience was like for the teachers. What did they need to do it successfully? What did they struggle with? The other was to generate resources for the instructor support materials, which were always intended to be multimedia sort of web-based things. So Estrella took over all of the research on the teaching. So now I'm going to talk about her for a while. So get ready to turn red. So she conducted 3 related studies. First was focused on teacher listening and the role of knowledge of content in students, which came out in a 2012 publication. Then one focused on mathematical activity that mathematicians needed to engage in to work with the students' mathematical ideas. And then finally, a study of the mathematicians' experiences teaching with the curriculum, which she co-authored with 3 of the mathematicians at taught. So I'm going to quickly talk about what our findings were on those, and then you can read about the papers if you haven't read them. Shame, if that's the case. So the nature of the curriculum is that the concept immersion the students work. So they generate strategies and ideas when you work with the tasks, and the teacher needs to listen to what the students come up with to figure out what to do. So you have to make sense of what students are saying, and then think about how to work with those ideas to build the sort of target concepts. And so we analyzed classroom activities where students made contributions that could have been useful for moving things forward, but the teacher wasn't able to make sense of them to do that, to try and figure out what's holding them back. And what we found was, and we actually used Deborah Ball's framework to try to figure out, can we use any component of their knowledge to try and explain why this teacher struggled in some places. So what we found was knowledge of content in students is super important. So the kind of knowledge that we actually generate with our research. So that's convenient. So we knew things that if only she had known them, essentially is how that worked out. And so, so basically what they needed was they need to know what students usually do when we give them the task. What do they struggle with? What are they likely to come up with as ideas? How are they going to think about things, and what consequences might that have for what unfolds? So that was the findings of that one. The other thing she did, so you may be aware that a lot of the research on teacher knowledge of teaching it sort of sounds like it's stuff that you put in their head and then you put it in the classroom and that helps them, right? So another way to think about it is looking at the math that the teachers do while they're teaching. So instead of just looking at knowledge as a resource, it's more of a math and action kind of approach. So she did an analysis of the teacher's mathematical activity as they were working with students' ideas. And what she found was that they needed to do a lot of math actually when you're teaching with this curriculum, and that how they do that matters. So a couple of things they need to do: interpret, listening. So listening was one of the mathematical activities that she identified. Analyzing and evaluating students' ideas, conjectures, justifications, and identifying connections between ideas. It turns out that the teacher's mathematical activity of these kinds can either be supportive or constraining. I can say this really simply. One thing that happens is someone says, "Ooh, I have a conjecture," and then your teacher like, "Oh, that's interesting. Oh yeah, I can see if you." And then you basically verbally prove it as you're thinking through it in front of them. So I did some really awesome activity, but what I didn't do is let the students think about it. I do this all the time. This is how I know that this can be a bad thing. What else are you going to do? They give you a conjecture, you're talking. Don't judge. Anyway, so Australia talked about this for a couple consecutive years as she worked through these ideas. I remember getting some great feedback from Rena when she gave this talk, and then hopefully this one was way more awesome as a result, right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. So it is true that sometimes people will tell you things after your talk at these conferences, and it's actually helpful. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying that you might be able to help me by being critical about my ideas at the end of this talk. I don't want to encourage that kind of behavior. So then Astray conducted a study to figure out what it was like for these mathematicians to teach the curriculum. So she did this really fun thing where she asked them what sort of stood out to them and their experience, and then she had them respond to each other's responses. They kind of went around like that. And if nothing else, we got a really cute response from one mathematician about one thing that you're going to enjoy in a minute. So there are 3 themes that came up: were coverage, shockingly, goals for student learning, and roles of the teachers. So these were things where the instructors' opinions differed in kind of interesting ways. So the coverage, so this is a common fear you talk about with teaching this kind of a course. What if I don't cover everything? And John, who was the first one to work with this and ended up being a co-PI on this grant, this was his big concern going in. He admitted that all along. He never really kind of stopped being concerned about it, but he did notice a lot of other benefits happening instead and became more comfortable based on that. Julie felt that if you treat the key topics in depth, you don't really need to worry about whether the other ones get covered. Lee basically thought this whole question was BS. So he rejected concern, called this nonsense. Coverage issue was nonsense. Basically arguing, he had a lot of arguments actually about this, but one of them was that the amount that you cover is not equal to the amount that they learn, so why are we caring about that? Lee was very fun. So goals for student learning. So the curriculum engages students in reinvention, and so by design, both the process and the mathematics are valued. Okay. Lee, shockingly, strongly felt that the process was the only thing that matters, and he just really felt that we do a terrible job of teaching mathematics because we don't have students do things that are representative of what mathematicians do. And that was mind-blowing to him whenever he realized that. I don't know when this was, but he was just went around confused as to why we do this. And so he actively sought out ways to do better things. John and Julie basically had more of a balanced view, which is they always really cared what came out mathematically. Lee was more support whatever they're doing because that's what I'm about, is them doing mathematics. And then finally, the role of the teacher. So the curriculum asks the teacher to be responsible for the development of the ideas without sort of taking ownership away. So it can be a tricky dance. Like I mentioned just a second ago, Lee felt his job was to support whatever it was they were doing. He never would let the goal of getting a particular math out have him get in the way of the students doing what it was they were doing mathematically. There was one exception to that, but I believe, one particular topic where he really bad about it. And then he felt really guilty afterwards for shutting students down to teach them something. John was very goal-driven. He literally felt like his job was always to figure out how to get to the next place from what the students were doing now. Whereas Julie actually thought about it very much like the way we designed the curriculum, which was that her job was to try to get the ideas to come out from the students and then figure out how to help them work with those ideas to move them forward. So, drawing on insights from all of these various projects, we put together our instructor support materials, which were extremely innovative. So our goal was to provide key pieces of information to the instructors without overwhelming them. We know a lot of things about what they might want to know, and it can be a lot to see all one, especially when you're teaching for the first time. So we focused on 3 kinds of things to tell them. One was the rationale for each task and sequence and unit. So why are they doing what they're doing? What's the point? And then information about student thinking, which we always sort of thought of as the most important thing. What are students likely to come up with? What are they likely to struggle with? Things like that. And then what difficulties might they have? And then finally, some suggestions for implementation, which honestly we were always quite shy about that. But they're in there. Some sort of, mostly they're sort of folk knowledge. This seems to work, and so we would write that in there. The student thinking was great because that was one that we did research on stuff, so we could say stuff that we actually knew. And the rationale, we had theory to support what we were doing. But it's all in there. So it looks like this. Here's John again. His picture's in here twice. That's twice as many times as Marilyn, which now I still feel really guilty about. And Elise is on there. Stray is also a picture on this thing, but you have to imagine it scrolling. And eventually you'll get to a stray. All right, so this is what the website looks like now. So one thing about the only way you can actually get the tasks, the curriculum itself, is through this website with the instructor supports. So you can't have one without the other.
Yep.
And so the way it works is you have the task in like a big box, and then you have these drop-down boxes where you can decide, do I want to know more about rationale? Do I want to know more about student thinking? Do I want more about implementation? So for example, bam, you click on student thinking and the thing drops down. There's lots of information about student thinking. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a link there. So it's click here for more. And so you follow one of those. So this will be like a paragraph saying what students might do. But then if it connects to a really important issue that we had studied in our research or that we knew was a big deal, we'd kick them over to a more detailed thing. They might watch a video. So this is one where a student is explaining why they buy, so if you have an equation, two symmetry is equal to each other, for them, if you put the same symmetry on the end of each of those, that makes perfect sense. If you put the same symmetry in the front of those, didn't buy it at all. And this is the teacher trying to figure out why that would matter. Because she's a mathematician, she knows very well this is a binary operation. As long as it's well defined, this is going to be fine either way. But the student's not thinking about it that way, and what this is about how the students think about this, which is as a left-to-right process at this point, in which case, if you tack on the same symmetry to two stories that are already equal, of course that's fine. It's already equal, you do the same thing. But the other, you're like changing the beginning of the story, so is that okay? I don't know, the student didn't think that was okay. She couldn't figure out why that might not be okay, and then Stray wrote a whole paper about that. Sure. All right, so at RUME, here's another slide, we gave a talk about our process of taking our research findings about teaching and learning with the curriculum and building these materials. And then, so this is like the end of the middle. 2 years after we ran out of money, we're still working, and Australia and I edited with Keith's help, thank you Keith, a special issue of JMB where we basically tried to describe all of the stuff we had tried to do, which was fun and really hard. There's 6 papers in there. One paper is about the process of designing and scaling up, so sort of globally looking at the whole process of the project. Then there was a paper about, well, there's 2 local instructional theory papers, one about groups and isomorphism, one about quotient group. There is a paper about the mathematical activity of the teachers that I mentioned, that study that Stray did. And then there's a paper about mathematicians' experiences. And then there's a paper about the process of developing the instructor support materials that Elise was the lead author on. And it looks like this. I don't know why it makes me happy to like show a picture of an actual book, but that's the actual book. So yay. And then, still in the middle of the story, because while Stray and I are doing this huge job with no money for free, because research, right? Because that's one of the things I have to do to get promoted and stuff. Right, that was how we did it. I was wondering why that was. Yeah. Anyways, while we were doing that, Mark Yanada, another PhD student of mine and a full-time community college instructor, he developed he calls it a bridge course, which is a course for students that are basically done with the community college mathematics that they can take, and they want to transfer to PSU or someplace else to be a math major. And so they're getting ready to transition from their sort of computational procedural courses to proof-based courses. And so there's, they usually have 5 or 6 of them kind of around, or 10 or 20, it's gone up over the years. And so he built a course to support them in that transition. And so what he did was I'm skipping ahead. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. Kate, meanwhile, took on the challenge of creating a conflict inventory of a group theory, which is that thing that I asked for like $600,000 to do with a huge team.